I have been asked to share this paper that I have written for our seminar on music ministry. And initially the idea was for each one of us to tackle some model of ministry, either from the past, the present, and maybe where we're going to go in the future. So, most of you know who I am. I'm Maria Monteiro, and I am a Baylor student now in the doctoral program in church music, but I'm also a music director in this church in San Antonio, First Mexican Baptist Church, which is a bilingual congregation now. And I teach in this small Baptist college in San Antonio, which is small but highly diverse. We had about 250 students last semester, I think, but when we look at the staff, students, and faculty, we had 23 countries represented. So every time we have a group of 6 or 7 people, there will be 4 countries represented. So that kind of gives an interesting environment to work. Most from Latin America, but we do have students from Korea and China and Haiti and Nigeria, so that's a lot of diversity. So when I was deciding what I was going to look at, I decided to look at my own church, because I have learned quite a lot about this environment in San Antonio. I have been in San Antonio for about 13 years now, but I am from Brazil, and before that I had lived in Houston, which is also a very cosmopolitan place. I lived in Ohio, I lived in North Carolina, so I have been around seeing different sides of the Baptist world, I guess, always going to Baptist churches. But I found that this church has an interesting profile, and I thought then, since I have been working in the Hispanic context, I have also been able to discover this very lively track of church and ministry. I think sometimes when we get together and we are in the dominant culture, we sometimes feel that this is how the ministry works, this is where we have been, this is where we are, where we're going, like we're always kind of going pretty much in the same group. But I have found that we have gone a different track for many different reasons. And so the purpose of this, as we were talking in our seminar, is not necessarily, in my case, to compare, to evaluate. It's mostly to describe what goes on in this church as one way of doing music ministry today, in the specific context of San Antonio. And as I looked at the church and what goes on in the church, it may seem at first, well, this has nothing to do with my life, and why do I need to pay attention to what we're saying? But I think what I have heard and learned through this process is that my conclusions, what could be the benefits of understanding the church and what the church is and what we're trying to do, actually cannot be applied to the life of other ministers as we try to do music ministry. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read a few little snippets from my paper, and then I will discuss what I have learned, so I don't have to necessarily read the entire paper to you, but feel free to ask questions and interrupt. We have introduced ourselves first, but the 2 people that just came in, I already know them, so, but if you want to say your name.
My name is Sergio. I came from San Antonio. I'm a member of Trinity Baptist Church there.
So he has graduated from the UA, he works there, and he's here today because he's going to be playing the drums for our global song workshop going on right after this one. So I brought some musicians for us to explore that repertoire. And then
I'm Monteiro. I'm Maria Monteiro's graduate assistant.
He's my husband, so he helps me a lot.
Non-paid, of course, right?
That's very good. So this,
You're smart man.
I have give the title Mexican, American, and Baptist Worshiping as a Double Minority in San Antonio. and you get to understand hopefully what I mean by all of this, especially the double minority condition of being a Baptist in San Antonio. So this is a case study of a bilingual, predominantly Hispanic Baptist congregation in San Antonio, so I speak Spanish and English. And my goal was to explore some of the main issues related to music and worship in one of the oldest Hispanic congregations in the United States, the Primera Iglesia Bautista Mexicana de San Antonio. We actually have two official names in Spanish and English. First Mexican Baptist Church of San Antonio, founded in 1888. So in the case of this church, what I'm looking at is not just the music, its sources, the role it plays in the congregation, but also the people and the history of the church. I have used some scholarship, some pertinent scholarship addressing the topic, and also ethnographic data. I have interviewed 8 members of my congregation of varying ages, but people that have, even the younger ones, been very much involved in the life of the church. And also my own experience, I have been a member of this church for almost 10 years now, and I have been the music director for 9 years. So I have learned a lot through observation, through participation, and also the contacts that I have with the members and the life of the church. So I would like to describe first the church itself, a little bit about the building, how we got there, who we are, what we do, and then some issues of identity, and then finally language, and then how all that comes together as we decide to look at the music that's played and performed at the church. So one interesting thing about San Antonio is going to be 300 years old next year. But Texas is not 200, I don't think, yet. So San Antonio is an old city, but it had to go through a very drastic switch as it became part of the United States, no longer Mexico. So, in 1888, an American missionary who was working in Mexico, in Saltillo, was sent from the church to San Antonio to preach to Mexicans. So it was a Mexican enterprise, even though the preacher was an American missionary who had been sent to Mexico. So he came to San Antonio and he preached. Several people accepted Jesus, and they were baptized under the authority of the Saltillo church, but eventually in that same year, 1888, they organized a church in July 1st. So we just celebrated 129 years since we have been founded. The congregation has moved around in the course of its history, but since the year 2000, that marks a big shift also in the history of the church. It meets in the former home of Manor Baptist Church near downtown San Antonio. Manor Baptist Church was founded around 1945, it was organized, and it grew and became a very wealthy, lively congregation. It had about 2,000 members at some point. So this building has 4 stories, a 500-seat sanctuary, a fellowship hall, a chapel, an industrial-grade kitchen, a gym, a library, dozens of meeting rooms, and ample office space. But when Manor could not really, survive the demographic change in the neighborhood, it decided to do something. So throughout the 1990s, the church was down to close to 40 members. So from 2000 to 40, there was no way these people could actually maintain this huge, gigantic building. Primera, our church, was downtown San Antonio without much place to go, no parking, no way to remodel the building, no money, plus it's very tricky to do things in downtown San Antonio because it was a historic area. So the church considered actually merging, but it was clear from both sides that that was not going to work. But eventually, Manor Baptist simply dissolved, and then they transferred the building to First Mexican Baptist Church. So the Manor Baptist members, they decided it's better for this to continue to be a church, even if it's not us that are using this building. So around that time, the name was changed officially, so Primeira Iglesia Bautista Mexicana, and now we also have First Mexican Baptist Church. A few of the members from Manor decided to stay, but both congregations actually lost members. Some rather not be members of anywhere, and they just got a letter saying, no, we are free to go, there is no more Manor Baptist Church. And some people that were members of Primera said that we don't think we can make this transition. This building doesn't feel like this is our church. So it was kind of a difficult time. I was not at the church at that time yet, but I have heard many stories because many of these people are still there. So a few former members of Manor decided to stay, even though they did not speak Spanish. At that time, First Mexican Baptist Church was almost exclusively a Spanish-speaking congregation. So that was a very daring decision, I think. But in some cases, many of these people had no contact, and we heard that from them with their own words. With Mexicans, they didn't speak any Spanish, but they thought this was their church, and they decided, we want to be here. So now, this is where we are, in this very big building. I've been there 10 years. I'm not sure I have been in every hallway, in every room in that church. For the first few years, I actually asked Andy, can you take me on a tour? Because I'm afraid I'm going to go and not be able to find my way out. One of the older members of the church, he's now one of our deacon emeritus. No, he worked for Manor and then he stayed with Primera, and I think he turned 92 recently. And he told us that the church was built to serve also as a bomb shelter. This was in the 1945s and 50s. And he said, actually, and your cell phone doesn't work in many parts of the church. If you go in the basement, it's like nobody can hear you, nobody can find you. So it's a very impressive building, and that's where we are today. Now, it's interesting that the church received from Manor everything that they had. They simply left. The building was given to us with everything, all furniture, equipment, an extensive choral library, several pianos, and even a pipe organ that until recently, the members of First Mexican Church had no idea the value of that instrument. We have had a few people come and play, but recently we have an organist playing regularly for us, and we begin to, invite the technician, tell us what we need to do, and he said, well, my father was the one who actually put this organ here, and I know it very well. It was bought from Harvard Simmons University, actually, and the way it is now is still worth over $750,000, and the pastor couldn't believe, because first I said, well, we may have to spend $10,000, and he said, $10,000, well, but this is how much it's worth. So the church was very surprised to know that, because that is kind of unheard of, I think, in a Mexican church. Now, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the people that are members of the church. So, a membership profile. So, Mexicans, Hispanics, Latinos,
Share some information.
Tejanos, which is a Texan of Mexican descent. All of these terms are used to refer to Mexican American in Texas. And people in Primera fall in each one of these categories. In addition, we have a few Anglo members of the church, those who stayed, who were members of Manor, and then a few other immigrants from places such as Cuba, Ecuador, Peru, and we have a few Brazilians like me that are part of the church. So we begin to see that it is bilingual, Spanish and English, but also a little multicultural in the sense that we have a variety of cultures represented in the church. There is an interesting book called An Introduction to Latino Protestantism in Brazil, where the author, Juan Francisco Martinez, gives us, in the United States, sorry, An Introduction to Latino Protestantism in the United States. And he offers a list, a description of all types of Latinos in the United States according to the way they relate to the dominant culture. And I think this is interesting because I think I have met these people and I didn't have necessarily a category for them, and sometimes they don't even have it for themselves. But I found the way, of course, not, that doesn't include everybody, but I think it's very helpful to understand, especially in a place like San Antonio. Yes, they are a minority because they are Mexican Americans. However, in San Antonio specifically, Mexican Americans make up over 60% of the population. So there is a very large Latino or Hispanic community in San Antonio. So the author says most Latinos, like other minority groups in this country, live a polycentric reality, needing to know how to interact with both minority and majority cultures at all times. So Hispanics in Texas experience the strong pull of the dominant culture when they come into contact with the public school system and the US mass media, for example. But they are also influenced by the reality of constant migration and sharing a border with Mexico, Spanish language mass media, and the size of the Latino community. So it's different for Hispanic to be in San Antonio than to be in a place where the Latino community may be invisible. I think in the United States, this is becoming more difficult. I used to live in North Carolina in the early 90s, and there was one Mexican restaurant, and I think that was the only Mexican family I knew of in Durham. It was not a tiny city, but they were really invisible. But in many places now, I have heard in Alaska there is a great number of people from Guatemala that work there. So they are everywhere. But especially in the case of San Antonio, the community is huge and very visible. And although large in numbers, they still don't have a lot of political power, they don't have a lot of money, but at least they have the presence there. So the Hispanic in San Antonio has kind of these two forces constantly around him or her. So there is a dominant culture. Yeah, this is Texas, the United States, but then this is San Antonio. This is the Hispanic culture that's very strong here. So according to this relationship, how this Hispanic person relates to the dominant culture, this author Martinez, he lists some possibilities. So we may have immigrants who are considered transnational people. So they move back and forth between Mexico and the United States without sometimes documentation, although now it's harder to do that. But there was a time when it was no big deal to just come and go. So immigrants that move back and forth and they cross the border and they carry this culture back and forth with them, and it's natural for them. That is no big deal. Being in Mexico, being in the US, they feel equally comfortable. So they are transnational people. A second type, these are the nuclear Latinos. And if they live in a place with a large Latino population, sometimes they can be completely immersed in that culture. Completely immersed in that culture, almost exclusively. So I have met many Latinos like that they have lived all their lives here, they do not speak English. There was a lady that I met actually when I was here, going to this small mission. And one time I asked her, she spoke no English, and I said, when was the last time you went to Mexico? And she said, I have never been to Mexico. And I was surprised, especially because this lady, she used to talk about things such as, this costs 5 pesos. She would not even use dollars. She used pesos. But she had never been to Mexico. Wow. But the truth is, in this area many times, yeah, she was here when it was Mexico, and then the border crossed, and then now she's in the United States, but she never moved. And the land belonged to her family, but she didn't have opportunity to go to school. She knew very little. I think she went to 3rd grade. Never learned English. And she was in her late 60s at the time. So some people that live completely immersed in the culture. I had a friend who came to BUA. He's from New Hampshire and he works in Michigan. And he came to do some workshops for us at BUA. And he told me the second day he was there, now I understand how people can live here and not speak English. He said, I never understood that. But I came to San Antonio, had never been there before. And he said, since the moment I arrived here, I have heard Spanish, in hotel, in the airport, the taxi, the restaurant. People, and that's common, you still meet many people in San Antonio that speak no English. And they look at me, so they immediately start speaking Spanish because they assume, and now I do communicate, not perfect Spanish, but because, this is a huge community. So that's possible to live like that. And remember, I'm talking about these types, and all these people are present in this congregation where we work. There are bicultural Latinos. These are the ones who are bilingual, and they function very well in both communities. So they usually live their public lives according to the culture of the majority, but they may have their private lives according to the culture of the minority. And in some cases, it's interesting that they function so well that people, let's say, in the work environment may never know that they actually speak Spanish at home, and that's how they live. And people in their families are surprised to see how well they function outside of the Latino environment. So they are truly bicultural. There are the marginal Latinos, those who have adopted most of the values and lifestyles of the dominant culture, but they still enjoy some of the markers of the Latino culture, such as the celebrations, food, and the music. So they have that, but mostly adapted to the majority culture. Another interesting type, the Latinos who are fleeing from their culture, because they have understood their way of seeing it, that the only way they can succeed in the United States, in the dominant culture, is to reject their original culture. So these are the people that sometimes will be very offended if you think that they speak Spanish, or if you ask them, are you Mexican? We have had experience. We have a student who came to be in an ESL class, and we took them on a tour in the missions in San Antonio, and he was very happy because he couldn't speak English yet to see this lady working there, and she had, her appearance, she looked like she could be from Mexico. Her name was, I don't know, Rodriguez or Garcia, something like that, and he immediately approached her and spoke in Spanish. She said, we are in the United States. We speak English here. I do not speak Spanish. And he got really, really upset. She doesn't like to be confused as with somebody that's a member of this community. There are some Latinos, this is another type, that maybe they have been away from that culture, but they have decided to look for their roots. And sometimes they are even a little upset, how come I don't speak Spanish? How come my parents didn't teach me Spanish? And they get a little upset about that because they feel like they're part of something that may be fading, and they want to find a way to preserve. So we have met people that now they want to celebrate and reconnect, and they want to learn Spanish and be in the middle of this community again. And then we have the Latinos that have completely assimilated, and they have really no meaningful connections with the Mexican culture anymore. And they have been so removed from it that they may just know an event. I know in the past somebody from my family came from Mexico, but I have no idea who they were. And so I have no connections. They're completely assimilated into the dominant culture. And the final type, which is also interesting, is the Latino who assimilates into another minority culture. It's if a Latino marries into a Korean family or into an African American family. So now they have the experience of being minorities twice, but with a different experience, but still not necessarily into the majority culture. So this looks like a long list, but what I find fascinating about it, because I can think of people that fit in each one of these categories, and some that are not even described here. And I find it interesting because I know them, and I could say we have almost all of these people in our own congregation. And I think I'm saying all of this also to kind of, I guess, illustrate what it's like to be inside this community. Because some people looking from the outside, they say, oh, they're all Hispanics, they're all Mexicans, they all speak Spanish, it's all the same thing, they should get along and they understand each other. But there is great variety within this community. I interviewed these church members, and I asked them which term they prefer to use when referring to themselves, especially here in the United States, and how they like to describe their ethnicity. So it was interesting that even the people that have been born in Mexico, they have been here a while, but they are Mexicans, and they all vacillated a bit when I said, how do you like to be called? And they were a bit unsure at first. So there was one that said, I was born in Mexico, but here I'm fine with the term Hispana, or Hispanic. Some of my interviewees seemed indifferent. I offered some options. So do you like to be called Tejano, Mexican American, Hispanic, Mexican, American? And he said, I don't care. I can relate to all of these categories, and to me, it doesn't matter. He told me a very interesting story. His father, when he was younger, has just got married and was looking for a job. He needed a birth certificate. So he went back to Mexico, to the little village where he grew up. And when he got there, his relatives said, no, you are not Mexican, you were born in Texas. So he didn't even know where he was born, and that was not an issue. What I have learned from these people now in their 60s and 70s, when they're children, and then their parents also told them, the border was very elusive. People would come and go, and sometimes, like in this case, he didn't even know he was an American. Today, this would be a very, very precious document to have. But he said, I didn't even know I was Texan. I thought I had been born in Mexico as I was raised. So another one I also find interesting, she grew up in San Antonio. She was born in San Antonio and grew up there. But her mother did not speak English. So she grew up speaking Spanish at the home. And she said the first time she went to Mexico City when she was 18 years old. And while she was there, she was asked what she thought of Mexicans. Do you like them? And she said, of course, I am Mexican. And the man said, no, you are not. You are not a Mexican, you are American. And no, the conversation was in Spanish because that's the language she spoke at home. So she was completely shocked by the fact that she always thought that was not an issue, but she could be American and Mexican. But in Mexico, they said, no, you are not Mexican, you are American. And that's the first time. She was 18 years old. She had never questioned who she was, where she came from. So this issue of identities, I think, is a very interesting issue in this community. And another example, this Mexican-American was born in San Marcos, and he said that he always thought of himself as being an American. He knew he was American. He was born in San Marcos. But everyone else called him Mexican. So he simply accepted the label. And he said he was not sure why, but it was clear to him that the term Mexican was used in a negative way. He felt that much. And to him, Mexico only meant the place where his parents came from, no more, no less. And he said, even today, I know very little about Mexico. I have been to Mexico a few times, but all I really know about Mexico is what I have learned from Mexicans here in Texas. But he's still described as a Mexican. So imagining all of these variations of people inside the congregation according to their ethnicity, their place of origin, I was talking to them in the context of our congregation, if these differences influence the way we relate in the church. So are there lines drawn between Mexican Americans and immigrants, between the Mexican Americans who only speak English, or the ones who are bilingual, or the Mexican immigrants who actually speak English and all that? And they said, no, all of them said, the way I think that they relate to each other is very much like in any other church. So they are in the music ministry, so they tend to be kind of part of that group, or they work in the food bank, so they make friendships like that. And there is no difference really in the sentiment of the members towards each other, related to the fact that, okay, this is a Mexican American, this is a Mexican immigrant, this young undocumented couple, or this is an elderly Mexican American person whose family has been here for generations. What really kind of may draw lines within the congregation is the issue of language. So more than identity, is actually the issue of language. Because Spanish is the main language spoken at the church. So even though we calculate, see, we don't have very good statistics, numbers, and lists are very difficult to keep in the church. And I think it's interesting, I think part of that is also a lot of these immigrants, they do not like to give a lot of information about their telephone number, their address. Some of them, especially if they have somebody in the family of themselves, they may be undocumented, they feel very vulnerable about sites. So it's always a big challenge to find phone numbers for people because they change constantly and we don't have. But in general, you would say that about over 50% of the congregation is fully bilingual, over 50%. But about 40% speaks only Spanish. And then just a few speak only English. And many times this will be some young adults. They may have grown up in a time when they could not speak Spanish in school, and sometimes their parents will just protect them with the idea that, it's better for you not to speak Spanish. Just, I hope that you do well in English, and that's what's going to be good for you. So I also find interesting that, so we have this large number of bilingual people in the church, and among those that are fully bilingual, they have never been part of an English-speaking congregation only. They have always, even when they moved states in the cities, they have always looked for a church where Spanish is spoken, even though they were fully bilingual. So that's...
I have a question. And this might be beyond the scope of it, but how many, would you say, of the congregation are like Baptist from birth, like their families were Baptist, or is there some tension about like that many of them might be converts from Catholicism or something like that? Is that part of that?
Yes, that's part of that, and we will talk a little bit about that. Okay. It has an impact sometimes in the way they see the life of the church. We have found that they have, that's part of being the double minority view of this congregation, because sometimes they have been persecuted. I mean, I interview people in their 80s now, and they remember growing up in Mexico, for example, and having stones thrown at them and calling them daughters of Satan because they were Protestants. So that was the feeling they had. Now here I find interesting, also in Brazil it's kind of a similar thing. We are kind of, in terms of religion, we are mostly Christian, Catholic, and then Protestant. So we don't really, in Brazil, and I assume in Mexico is similar, we don't deal with, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism.
Sure.
We have plenty of Jews in Brazil. I have not found one that's practicing. I mean, they are ethnic Jews. But so for us, the world is divided in Catholics and Protestants. And the work of the Protestants is to convert the Catholics. That's pretty much how we grew up. And I think in Mexico, it's so interesting because the word they use they don't use Protestant, right? Especially Baptists, we don't like to say that. In Mexico and Brazil, it's the same thing. But they have the word Catholic, and then they have the word Cristiano. So the world is divided in Catholics and Christians. That's how they talk about it, right? So the people coming from Mexico, they bring that with them, and they grew up like that. Now, if you grew up here, you are puzzled by that because you understand Catholics are Christian, right? So that's something that sometimes we have that tension. In many times, because the majority is this community that has this very strong ties to Mexico. I tell, when somebody comes to visit the church, I think, you think you are in San Antonio, you are in Monteiro. That our church is kind of like, we are in Monterey Sunday morning. We have a lot of connections and families. So those feelings come into play. So somebody else that comes, is a convert from here, they will be a little, well, this is a strong feeling they have against, but that's something they have grown up with in Mexico, and that's still a big part. We have one church member that every time he gives a testimony, that's how he was converted, and he can't believe people are still praying to the Virgin. and she has no power, it was Jesus. I mean, every time, that's his speech,
Interesting.
every time. So that's very much a part of the congregation. So, but I think I find interesting that they, even though they can speak English and they grew up here, and sometimes more than one generation, they still seek a church where Spanish is spoken. We have tried to recruit people. We have decided now, since the year 2000, to start a service in English in addition to the Spanish service. We do not do bilingual. We have found they do not like. Nobody likes bilingual because a lot of people are bilingual, so you hear the same thing twice. No, you translate yourself all the time. I have been in churches like that, but in our church, we have to tell them ahead of time, okay, there's going to be one Thanksgiving service. So when Christmas is the 25th, we do have a service, but it's going to be one service. It's going to be bilingual, but that's not something that they like. So we have the English service, the Spanish service. The English is very, very small. And we try to, invite people, recruit them. Can you come to the English? Because you are fully bilingual. We have the leader of the Sunday school in English. She will go to the Spanish service. Said, no, I do everything in English, but I cannot worship in English. I had to do that in Spanish. So this issue of language is very, very important. One thing that's, I think, worth noticing is that talking to them, Spanish has been, at some point in the history of Texas, illegal, right? In the school, I couldn't believe it, but the students could not speak Spanish in school. So somebody in my generation is very common that they grew up without being able to know any Spanish. It's because the parents would like to protect them. They could not speak Spanish. We have some former students who came to our school when it was still a seminary. They came from Mexico and she was 7 years old and she had a little brother. She went to school and she was told you were going to be punished if you speak Spanish. And she couldn't understand because she didn't speak English either. She was just a new arrived immigrant. And she was so traumatized that she said for 6 months, she didn't speak at all. No English, no Spanish. Because for her language to be illegal, the language that she speaks at home, I have students who also said, they didn't even want to take tortillas for lunch. They were embarrassed. And they came to tell the parents, please, do not send tortillas anymore. And I think looking back, though this is not really my story, I have a different background, but I think this is a very touching thing for you to be embarrassed of the food that you eat at home and the language that you speak, that your parents speak. And they don't even speak English. For it to be, considered illegal, that's very traumatizing. So, in the case of our church, not speaking Spanish greatly limits the ability of a member of the church to participate fully in the life of the community. Spanish really dominates, and this is a very important point. That also influences what we sing, right? But Spanish is very central. Now, in the case of these church members who are fully bilingual, but they still prefer Spanish, I find interesting because this raises some issues. Now I've been talking about identity, assimilation, and the preservation of culture. So one author, Paul Barton, suggests that because of the bilingual and bicultural nature of the Mexican-American Protestant churches in Texas, these congregations have facilitated the assimilation of Mexican immigrants into American society, while at the same time enabling assimilated Mexican Americans to gain an awareness of their cultural heritage. So this goes on all the time. The new immigrants come and say, oh, this is how we live here as a Mexican American. This is how the dominant culture works. But then those that have been here a long time, that are barely speaking Spanish anymore, they get the newcomers from Mexico and they say, oh, this is what it was like for my parents. This is where I came from. So we have this constant kind of crossing of information in the congregation. I think this is also very important. Also, Latino churches have often been one of the few places where a new generation learns formal Spanish, right? They may watch TV, soap operas, they see commercials, cartoons, but the formal Spanish, maybe that's the only place where they can learn that. So through much of the 20th century, schools were teaching English often punishing children for speaking Spanish and working for children to make a language shift. But Latino Protestant churches have usually been one of those places where the use of Spanish has been encouraged and defended. The churches also have historically been a safe haven for young Latinos to test and affirm their Latino identity. So that this is part of the job of the church. It's not just, oh, I cannot speak English, I'm going to go to this church. There is much more going on in the preservation of the culture and the striving to keep the Spanish going. I feel that very much when I teach children's choir, for example. It's a big responsibility because I feel the pressure. When I first got to church, are you going to teach Spanish songs to the children? Because I can communicate in Spanish, but I never studied it, so I feel much more comfortable in English in this context. But I understand the message. The children, they are going to learn about their faith in Spanish. The parents sometimes do not speak English, so when the children sing, they want to understand what they're saying. So if they sing in English, the parents are left out. And also the parents who do speak Spanish also like to see that the kids are doing it themselves. So this is also behind the idea of being a church that speaks Spanish. And we have children that we see them speaking only Spanish. They go to school, and then it's harder and harder for them to speak Spanish, right? Unless the parents really make a strong point. And some parents don't. So by the time they are in middle school, many of them can no longer speak Spanish. And some of them say, I don't even understand all of that. So there is this idea inside the church that's very important. The church needs to do its job at teaching good, formal, elegant, eloquent Spanish to the generation, because outside they will not have a chance to do it. And the parents will value that very much.
Do you feel like this is an intentional thing, like a formal, like a part of the vision of the church, or something that happens like organically, like
I
naturally?
think it's more organically, because they have lived the experience. So we have parents, for example, one of my interviewees, she speaks very little English, but she was working in an English company in Mexico before she came. So she knew enough English to work, right? And she came here, she got married. Her husband he has been here even longer than her. He never wanted to learn English. So they have one daughter. And I said, did you ever consider going to an English-speaking church? And she said, for a little while, because of my daughter, I thought maybe it would be good for her. But then I realized, here in my church, and this is a very good point, I am a leader. She has been the leader of the WMU, she does all this and that. Her English is not good enough for her to have a place in an English-speaking congregation. So part of this is to know many of these people, especially the ones who speak only Spanish, the church is also the place where they do have a voice. They have authority, they have some kind of position of leadership. Outside, who are they? Especially if their English is not very good, nobody. In our church, for example, we have deacons, excellent Sunday school teachers, leaders of the WMU. They do not speak English. Outside of that, they are working as construction workers, they are doing loan work, right? So they are sometimes the invisible general worker. But inside the church, they have that position, the opportunity they have great gifts, and they sing and they lead and they teach. And if we don't have Spanish, they cannot do it, right? So this one lady, she said she considered for a little while, but she told her daughter, we're going to go to Mexico frequently. Her whole family lives in Monteiro. She goes, sometimes feels like every month she goes there. And she said, you are on your own. If you don't know how to speak Spanish, they're going to make fun of you, and it's going to be your responsibility. So you learn Spanish, right? And she is fully bilingual. She speaks beautifully Spanish and English. But it takes sometimes the parent concern and valuing the language. Many parents are on the other camp, like we mentioned, they want to flee from that. So no, I don't need to know Spanish. We are in Texas, I don't need that to be successful. So we hear sometimes in children's choir, the kids who say, why do I have to sing in Spanish? Are usually the ones who come from homes where the parents, even though they are Hispanics, they speak no English. No Spanish. They no Spanish. They understand very little. And so they have not passed on to their children this idea of being bilingual, right? And then we have children that come all the way. There is a girl in high school I admire greatly. She has been here all her life. She speaks Spanish perfectly. She reads, because that's the other thing. Sometimes they can speak, but they can't read. But so these parents have made this big effort to say, no, this is something that's important. I think now it's become a little easier in a sense because outside of the Mexican-American culture, people recognize speaking Spanish is a plus, right? People are wanting to be bilingual gives you an advantage. So now people have other reasons, although for them sometimes it's not very clear that this is the reason. It's mostly about preserving their own culture. Now going back just to make it clear, what makes this population, like I say, they worship as a double minority? Well, it's because they are affiliated with the Baptist faith, right? In Mexico, the Catholic population is very large, the second largest in the world. And even though the numbers are declining throughout Latin America, but in Mexico it declines much, much slower than, let's say, in Central America or Brazil, for example. So, and also, so we have that. We all think you are Mexican, you should be a Catholic. But also, think now San Antonio. There are historic events that happen in San Antonio that created some kind of resistance against the dominant culture, meaning the Protestants, right? Catholics in San Antonio. So the parish in San Antonio, San Fernando, it did not facilitate the assimilation of the newly arrived immigrants, but actually served as a symbolic focal point of Tejano resistance, right? This is the role of San Fernando Cathedral in that parish in the middle of San Antonio. So during the time of the incorporation of Texas in the United States, loss of economic and political power, as well as widespread prejudice against Mexican Americans, left the San Antonio Tejano population increasingly marginalized. So they were, at first, this is Mexico, this is who we are. But with the coming of the United States, these were people were pushed to the margins, geographically and metaphorically also. And interestingly, even the Protestant press also referred to the Tejano population with many racist derogative terms, calling them greasers. These were the Protestant press because they were also seen automatically as Catholics, right? So this is the baggage. But then, so for a Mexican American now in San Antonio to join a Baptist church places that person in a conundrum. How can a Mexican American switch allegiances, live in a religion that's deeply associated with one's ethnic and cultural heritage, in favor of the religion of the conquerors, the people who were intent in relegating the Tejanos to second-class citizenry? So, like I said, many people in our church, they felt this feeling in Mexico more than in San Antonio, because now, we are in the year 2017 already, but this idea of different people told me that story in different parts of Mexico being called daughters of the devil, right? Hijas del diablo, because they were children. They didn't even understand what that means. So this is what comes with them. So if they become a Baptist and they are Mexican American, they are a minority because they are Mexican Americans. But then within the Mexican American, if you're a Baptist, now you are a minority again inside the Mexican American community. And they feel sometimes isolated from their own community because of the lifestyle, especially in our church. The whole thing about don't drink is still very strong, which we don't see much in the dominant culture anymore. But in the Mexican culture, in the Mexican American culture, being a Baptist means you do not drink. So when they associate with their own family members, they said that creates some kind of tension because they can see in their behavior, you are not really one of us, right? So that's kind of one thing that sometimes they feel. Also interesting, this church that's full of Mexican Americans speaking Spanish, but they have decided to become Baptist, right? The culture of the dominant culture, the religion of the dominant culture. We have no association with any Baptist church that are not Hispanic. So within the Baptist world, we live in this, our own bubble, right? Because you think, well, we can get a lot of benefit from being in the majority religion. No, we have no connection, no connection. We do have associations of Hispanic churches in the state, in the city. Also, we have the Asociación Bautista in San Antonio, the city association. The church have great fellowship. They get together every month, they do banquets, they do dinners, breakfasts, they do all kinds of things. Every month, all churches meet. Pastors meet weekly of all Hispanic. So they have this great fellowship. And then at the state level, Texas has the convention within, there's the Texas convention, the Anglo convention as we say, but then we have our own convention. And this is really the third largest Baptist convention in the world. Hispanic, right?
Hispanic.
So they have Mexico, Brazil number 1, Mexico number 2, and Texas number 3. So it's a huge community, but many times invisible, doing their own thing. Nobody knows what's going on. And this is a church in San Antonio, like we're not in a very far removed, invisible place, right? But
I have a question. I'm not real familiar with the Baptist structure.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some formal denominational relationship with these churches, or is it completely separate?
No. We are, we have different layers of relationship, and the Baptist world has kind of a 2-track in a sense. I guess the Southern Baptist is split kind of 2 tracks. We actually associated with both of them a little bit. But what really matters is what the convention, the Hispanic convention as they relate to each other. I think they have more pull into these churches than, even though we participate. But the thing is, when you go to the Baptist Convention of Texas meeting, everything is in English. So if you speak Spanish only, why do you go? So unless it's in San Antonio, there's going to be a service, they will go. So they are officially kind of members, they cooperate a little bit, but they don't speak enough English to participate, to understand the meetings. They never had any positions in a committee or something like that, so
Sure.
they are very...
If I may say, one of the things about your question is that the primary characteristic of Baptist church is the congregational government.
Mm-hmm.
So every congregation is autonomous
Okay.
and does not receive commands or
From the denomination, there's no
yes.
unifying
They have kind of an agreed upon body of doctrines.
Okay.
And so, but even that is not enforced
On the
on the
actual
church.
level. Okay.
We don't have to, it's voluntary cooperation, but we kind of walk closely. So now I have just very little time left, but I think it's important because this is what makes us different, to understand all these layers of what goes on, the people that make up this congregation. In terms of music then, what do we do? Well, in our case, we're a very traditional congregation. We have piano and organ, we use hymnals.
What hymnal?
We use several. We meet in 2 main places. That's also part of, when you get there, it's like, okay, we're going to be in this building, what can we sing? Because in this building, we have 2 hymnals. In the chapel, we have all the hymnals. So here, in the main sanctuary, we have the English Baptist hymnal from 1991, and then we have the Himnario Bautista from 1978. That's not anybody's favorite, but for some reason, that's what we have in the sanctuary. Now, when you go to the chapel, Sunday evenings, Wednesday nights, we have an older edition, a 1955 hymnal published in Spanish, El Nuevo Himnario Popular. This is the favorite hymnal for the church, and many people don't. This is the real one. The 1978, they don't know what that, and I agree with them in some cases. I think the translations, I think they try to modernize a little bit, and the translations, some of them are horrible in 1978.
The music itself,
Oh.
how would you describe it? Is there a large Hispanic specific repertoire, or is it mostly translations of
Mostly
Yeah.
translations. And here's something interesting also. Now, this is the time when the missionary enterprise was going all over, and these were the hymns that the missionaries took with them. So our church that, in a sense, came from Mexico to San Antonio, though they brought with them that repertoire. This is what it means to sing to God. This is the repertoire. So our favorite songs in our church are It Is Well With My Soul, How Great Thou Art, Wonderful Words of Life, all in translation, right?
And Sea La Paz.
Yeah. and Master, the Tempest is Raging. That's just, I guess Dr. Music and I are the only ones who know that. But it's a phenomenon that's an old hymn that is a favorite. But one thing that's interesting about this, so they have defined for the church, and again, this is what came from Mexico. This is what we sing in church. But here's one thing that's interesting. All of these hymns are translatable and have been translated. So that is one way that the church can continue to be, a church. Because if we lean only on Spanish songs, if you come from here, you are not going to know them. No? But in the case of these hymns, you come from Brazil, you come from Peru, you come from Mexico. We all know this. So in the end, it's a very positive thing. And I think that in my conclusion, what I like to say also that this church has defined what it is to sing, what music is to be sung, and even if it was suggested by the missionaries, doesn't matter. We have embraced that. This is our music, and that gives us a great sense of stability. We are looking from the outside and looking at other things. We are completely unfazed, unruffled, unperturbed, but all these issues of contemporary, what is that? No, this is not an issue for us. This is a non-issue. We go on and on very comfortably. We have created this, and we nurture this, and we have people constantly coming, and we're thriving that way. That's one thing.
Can I say one thing about,
Okay.
it's related to what you're saying. If you come to our church, it's one of the most beautiful congregational singing that you can hear.
They like
These are
to sing.
these old
They
hymns.
sing loud.
They sing. You hear the congregation. That's something
And
that you
was
don't hear many places anymore, right?
The only time I heard a congregation cheer for him when she announced we were going to sing "Sea la Paz" this
Massive tempest is raging.
and when she said that, you heard.
I was new at the church at the first time because I found that in 1955 hymn, and I said, well, I wonder if they know this. So I announced that, and they went, whoa. and it's an amazing thing. So I have to say that, and so that's this. We have maintained our culture. We value simplicity and consistency. Also, this idea that we are the safe haven. People come from Mexico, and they can find Mexico in San Antonio. And this congregation is dominated by this sense. So this is, and I said, how do people keep coming to this church? I asked the deacons. Well, word of mouth. They come from Mexico, go to San Antonio, there is a primera there, and you're going to know the hymns that they sing. And so there is that we can include everybody that comes from an English-speaking background because they know the hymns. And also this, so in a sense, I think the music creates this space for us that's separate from everything else they have outside. And have maintained that like a safe haven. This is our place. And we are able to connect all these different backgrounds of the language, the level of, economic level, class, education, because we come together, and the music that's very comfortable and very well known makes this possible for us to bring it all together. I think I was singing the last time I sang this song, Master of the Temple. The little kids, dun, 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 they're kind of dancing in the pews. I mean, they grow up loving that thing. So.
Can I ask one more question? Sorry.
Yes.
About the choir music. Is that kind of the same in the same vein, or is that a little bit more?
I have a little more freedom in the choir music because it's a smaller group. But a lot of times, though, it's very hard to find choral music in Spanish that the church can do. So we do what we can. Many times we sing hymns, and sometimes I actually do that. I have a very good translator, and if there is something in English that I really like, I said, can you get that in Spanish so we can sing? But many times the choirs have two different tracks. And we have back-to-back services. One is a completely different service. That's also very interesting, right? We don't sing the same hymns. Because sometimes the translation is more like a version.
Yeah.
This is a beautiful song about praising God for creation, and then you go to Spanish and it becomes a Christmas song. So I cannot do that song in both services. We have to be aware of that, right? So, but in the end, my conclusion, I have to skip around. But I would say that even though this may seem, from the outside, I have heard people say, you are making it much more complicated than it is. So I talked to somebody else who is Hispanic like me, and he said, oh no, this is very complicated. I know what you're talking. This is really very complicated. So in my conclusion is, so it's not necessarily your own skill, your formation, your ideas about worship. You go to a place like that, you have to have affinity and comprehension for who this church is, who are these people. And then you have to see how the ministry of music is going to work in that. So I think more than ethnic background, language skills, and technical capabilities, the ultimate factor influencing the ministry's effectiveness is always the same, no matter the context. Respect for the people he or she serves, the type of genuine care that shows concern for all, readily crossing all types of human-made borders. And I heard this beautiful testimony. I read it. He considered himself marginalized in the Tejano community. He's now in his late 70s. He said, the church opened its doors to us when access was denied in other places because we were Mexican Americans. It accepted and affirmed us while other institutions rejected us as well as our Mexican culture. It was in church that I learned that God was bilingual, that God understood Spanish. Whatever mode of music ministry, this is me saying now, one may prefer, it should never ignore the sacred space it will inhabit and the saints it will serve. So these are the saints at Primera. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for being here.